Welcome to episode 3 of Podnutz. This episode is about getting your questions answered. I talked about in the first and second episodes to submit any questions or comments you have on the form on the homepage of podnutz.com, and I got a lot of response from that, so I'm going to go ahead and answer some of the questions that were submitted. This episode may go the full hour, it may not. I'm going to try to get everybody's questions answered, and if I can't, we'll just save it for the next time. The first question is from Dan about hard drives. He asks, regarding his hard drive, the size on the box will state 200 gigs, but in actuality, it's only 186 gigs. Please explain why this happens. And what he means is, if he goes out and buys a 200 gigabyte hard drive at the store and installs it in his computer, Windows only recognizes it as 186 gigs. The reason why this occurs is this. There's actually two different types of measurements being used, and both have the initials GB, so it's very misleading. I actually took an excerpt from a forum at cnet.com where it's explained very well by a forum member named John Wilkinson. I'm just going to read it verbatim and then we'll go over it afterwards. He says, there are actually two different measurements of bytes, decimal and binary. When you purchase hardware such as hard drives, the manufacturer usually lists it in decimal, whereas the operating system will recognize it in binary. Now, decimal is a gigabyte, and that's equal to 1,000 kilobytes. Binary is the Gibabyte, which is equal to 1,024 kilobytes. They both are labeled as GB, but they're completely different numbers. Pretty tricky, huh? All right, I'm going to continue with what John says. For instance, if you purchase a 100 gigabyte hard drive, Windows will recognize it as 93 gigabytes, but it will say 93 GB in an effort to limit the confusion of the naming. This in itself can cause confusion, such as, where did the 7 GB go? It's there, but in a different way of recognizing and displaying it. That's also a reason a 125 megabyte file you downloaded to your hard drive may not fit on a 128 megabyte flash drive. Thus, when we're talking about hardware, including RAM, we say gigabyte and mean gigabyte. However, when we're talking about a file on our hard drive, we say gigabyte but really mean gibabyte. Gigabyte equals 1,000 kilobytes. Gibabyte equals 1,024 kilobytes. Hopefully I didn't confuse you there, but the bottom line is the hard drive manufacturers calculate a GB to equal 1,000 kilobytes, while operating systems such as Windows calculates a GB to equal 1,024 kilobytes. That's where you're going to get your difference. So a 100 gigabyte hard drive is going to equal 93 gigabytes, but it's still GB, so you're going to think it's gigabytes. And that's why that happens. Okay, next question. The next question is from Mark. He says, you have built a new system because you want more speed, although your old system runs well with no problems with the OS and you have many apps installed. Apps stands for applications. How can you move the hard drive to a new motherboard/CPU? It always gives boot problems because of drivers/BIOS issues. If it's an IDE hard drive, it should easily go into a new computer. And it should boot fine from that hard drive in a new computer. What's going to happen, though, is after it boots, it's going to ask you to activate Windows again because it thinks that you actually took a copy of Windows and put it into a new computer, which they don't want you to do. It thinks you're trying to copy Windows without paying for another license, when in reality you just switched the hardware. But this is how Microsoft tries to stop that, and this is why you have to reactivate Windows. So if you give Microsoft a call, there's a phone number on the activation screen. It won't let you go into Windows without activating it first. You call the number, you tell them you switched out the motherboard, and they will give you a key to type in and will reactivate Windows. Okay, so once you activate Windows and Windows finally boots up, it may look a little different than in your old machine. Probably because the video drivers are different. There might be no sound because the audio driver is not loaded, and there might be other things not working because those drivers aren't loaded. But the hard drive should still boot. What will be acting funny, though, is the video and audio and possibly Ethernet, but you'll always get a picture. It might not be the highest resolution, but you'll be able to work with the screen at least. At this point, you want to take the disk that came with the motherboard, the CD, and load all the drivers for that particular motherboard. That'll give you the sound, video, Ethernet, and other features of the motherboard. If you don't have a disk, you take the model number off the motherboard, go to that company's website, or just type the model number into Google, and then download the drivers from that manufacturer's website on the internet. That's the easy way. Now, with the new hard drives that are coming out called SATA, and SATA stands for Serial Advanced Technology Attachment. That's the new type of hard drives coming out. You may have seen them where they have a very thin cable that goes to the motherboard, whereas the old hard drives, PATA, P-A-T-A, also called IDE, and the P stands for parallel, those hard drives have that big fat ribbon. The problem if you use a SATA, which is a newer type, is a new motherboard's BIOS doesn't always recognize a SATA drive and is able to boot from it. If that happens, you can go into the BIOS of that motherboard and set the SATA to be a bootable drive. So restart your computer and go into the BIOS. Look for the word SATA probably in the boot menu, and you need to turn that option on. It might say SATA boot enable or something like that. Once that option is on, the computer will recognize that hard drive as a bootable drive, and if Windows is properly installed on it, it will boot from that drive. Okay, on to the next question. Brian asks, my girlfriend's Toshiba laptop screen has an area of darkened pixels. It's like a stripe on the left side of the screen. It is like this even before Windows boots. Do you have any suggestions? Unfortunately, I would have bad news for Brian. You're going to have to replace the screen on this. See, the LCD screens, when you get a black line or a colored line down the side of your screen or down the middle of the screen or horizontally across the screen, it's a bad sign. It's almost impossible to repair because the circuits that got damaged that actually are causing that problem are microscopic, and it's very, very difficult to fix that, if not impossible. The good news, or at least partially good news, is you can find a screen for pretty much any computer on eBay for a reasonable price, and they're not that hard to install. My suggestion for Brian is to type the model number of his laptop into eBay, followed by the word screen. So if he has a Toshiba A35 laptop, type Toshiba A35 screen into eBay and do a search and see if there's one for a reasonable price. New, you're probably looking at $150. You might be able to find a nice